Do not pay $128 for this palette until you watch this video until the end, because today I'm going to help you decide whether or not it's worth it according to your budget, preferences, and what you may already have at home. So I recently bought this palette during the Sephora sale, and if you didn't get your hands on it, it's fine. It's just eyeshadow, okay? Sephora will also probably do another 20% off discount, maybe towards the end of November, beginning of December, somewhere in that realm. They do it almost for the past couple of years. So if you miss Rouge or you don't have Rouge status, it will usually be 20% off for everyone, one-time code use. So let's say you wait until that sale, the palette will instead be about $102.40. But Danessa Myricks will of course be holding her own Black Friday sale with an even better deal. I believe this year may be 30% off, so that's so much better, and you get to shop directly on Danessa's website. Now at a full price, there are 18 shadows in here, so if you divide the 128 by 18 shadows in here, that makes each eyeshadow about $7.11, which isn't too shabby, because when you compare it to brands like MAC Cosmetics, their regular matte singles are about $11 per eyeshadow depending on the formula, which in comparison is pricier because they're not multi-chromes, they're not duochromes, they're literally just matte. And then we have the Terra Moon single eyeshadows, which can retail anywhere between $8 to $17. The Cliona single eyeshadows are anywhere between $8 to $18. And some of these formulas are very similar to ColourPop's Super Shocks, which retail for $7. So if you were to buy this palette, let's say all in singles, the price is not too shabby. Now that all depends on if you like every single eyeshadow in this palette, because at the end of the day, we're not buying these in singles, so it's not 100% comparable. To really calculate the cost for you, pick out each shade that you like or will get a lot of use out of, then take the price that you're going to pay, $128, or maybe the sale price of $89, and divide that by how many shades you actually like in this palette. So yes, there's 18 shades in here, and that's technically $7.11 per eyeshadow, but if you only like 10 shades in there, each eyeshadow is going to cost a little bit more, and then you can decide the value of the palette yourself. Now I did buy this palette solely for review, but when I look at all of the eyeshadows and the color story, it definitely screams my name, because I have a preference of blue, purple, and green on my eyes. I don't really wear red, orange, or pink that often, so personally for me, if I looked at this palette, most of the shades, if not all of the shades, would be worth my money. I obviously cannot make that decision for you. You just have to ask yourself what your preferences are when it comes to color, and the only way you really know that is by experimenting, and experimenting with a $128 palette may or not be worth it. That's completely up to you. So I'm going to go through every single shade to describe what they look like in person. Let's kick it off with the mini green palette, which personally is my favorite and the most neutral. This comes with the shade Golden Child, which is an opal white with a gold to green shift. The shade Warmth, which is described as a metallic copper with gold to pink shifts. Sand is a neutral sandy beige matte. Rooted is described as a baked terracotta brown matte. And Mother Earth is described as a forest green with an eggplant shift. Now in person, I do think that the descriptions are pretty accurate. So if you follow what the shades are online, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Moving on to the purplish palette. Now, I will say, although there are two really bright purples, this isn't as colorful as you might think, because these shades right here are fairly neutral. The first shade is called Love Potion, which is a white rose quartz with gold shifts. Then we have the shade Wish, which is an iced pink metallic. This to me actually comes off a little bit more silver on my eyes. Guiding Light, which is an antique pewter pink metallic. Spellbound is a magenta with emerald green shifts. And then Toasted is a mauve matte. Again, depending on the lighting, depending on your base and your eyes, these can shift one way or another, but the descriptions are fairly accurate for the purple palette. And you might be scared of these bright purples, but the matte shadow right here does come off a little bit more brown on the eyes, at least for me. If you're a lighter skin tone, it might appear a little bit deeper and more mauve. The shade Wish, although you can see there's like a purpley mauvey base, on my eyes I see more of the silver. The flaky shade to me comes off a little bit more rose gold on the eyes, but not really pink at all. And the iridescent shade has more of a gold shift. I don't really see pink in here. It just kind of depends on the lighting, but overall the shades in here, besides these bright purples, come off very, I wouldn't say neutral or natural, but not colorful on my eyes. So if you're buying this palette because you want something more wearable, I would consider these to be wearable, even if you're stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit. Now, in the blue palette, we have the shade Northern Lights, which is described as a smoky platinum. Dreamer, which is described as an aqua blue with periwinkle shifts. Magic Moon is described as a concrete gray matte. Mother's Love is a royal blue metallic. Grounded is a midnight black matte. And Star Power is a Milton silver with a dusty blue shift. Honestly, the two silver shades are a little too similar in my opinion to be in this palette. I wish you would have replaced it maybe with another matte. The blues are exactly as I described. I actually have this on my eyes today mixed with an eyeliner. As for the mattes, the black is a very deep matte. It's one of the best black matte eyeshadows that I've tried. I don't find it to be super patchy at all either. So online it does describe each finish to be 10 groundbreaking shades, which I'm not gonna lie is kind of excessive. I do think they over categorize each eyeshadow, but they did a good job at trying to explain the textures and the finishes of each eyeshadow, and they are true to how they're described online. But personally, I'm gonna simplify it, break it down into 3 categories based on how they perform. First of all, we have the matte eyeshadows. They are soft, buttery, blendable, and specifically buildable. So you're not going to get straight off pigment depending on the brush you're using, especially if you're using a blending brush. It is going to be more sheer pigment and you're going to have to build it up to get the impact and the color that you want. There are also the metallics, which has an impactful sheen and to me feels even creamier and more buttery than the mattes. In some ways, it kind of feels wet. These I think work perfectly okay with the brush, but like most shimmers, work better with your fingers. And the last most important formula in this palette that I think may make or break your decision are the foil flakes. So these are kind of like the metallic eyeshadows. They have that soft, buttery, smooth, almost wet-like feel, but the formula is chunkier in shimmer. So if you're not careful and you don't use this shadow properly, it can lead to a lot of fallout and patchiness. I do recommend when you're using this to apply it with your fingers only. It does not pick up well on a brush, and squish the chunky shimmers on the back of your hand and then pat it on your eyes to prevent any fallout or chunky shimmers getting all over your face. Personally, I don't think that this formula ruins my experience with the palette. It's just a slight adjustment in how I usually apply shimmers. But I will say, if you're not a finger application person, most of these shadows are not going to work for you because a lot of the shimmers pick up best with your finger and don't really work that well with a brush. So that is something you definitely want to keep in mind before buying this palette because your experience is going to be very different based on how you like to apply on eyeshadow. Oh wait, I take that back. There's actually a 4th formula I wanted to highlight. They're the sheer toppers, which in the pan it looks like a white eyeshadow, but it's really just a transparent base with some type of shimmer. The sheer toppers do remind me a lot of, at least the colors remind me a lot of the Cliona Pool tiles. Now when you look at these, the formula looks very similar to like the iridescent Cliona Pool eyeshadow vibe, but I've never tried that, so I can't really speak for how they compare. What I will say is that the feeling and the texture feels very putty-like, almost like the ColourPop Super Shocks. So if you like the ColourPop Super Shocks, honestly, this is kind of, if not the same-ish formula. So I think you'll really like the sheer toppers in this palette. So that's the overall color story. Personally, I do wish maybe 1 or 2 more of the shimmers that are similar looking to each other were replaced with mattes, because I do think it would make it a more everyday wearable palette for people who don't really wear shimmers that often, but you still have that, you know, pop of blue or pop of purple. For example, I don't think that we need 2 silver shimmers in here, although one is lighter and one is more medium. That could have been easily replaced with maybe another brown, maybe like a cool tone chocolate brown or something like that. And this palette, although these 2 greens are very different from each other, maybe we could have taken one out, replaced it with another matte. And in this palette, I do think this is screaming for another matte eyeshadow. I personally would have replaced maybe this shade right here, because although it looks like a purple, on my eyes it applies silver, which I already have 2 silvers in here. So I don't really want more silver shimmer. This could have been maybe replaced with a eggplant purple or something of that sort. But of course, I wanted to test the eyeshadows and see how they applied on my eyes. I touched on that a little bit earlier in the video, but now we're gonna move on to some eyeshadow looks I created. These aren't tutorials, so keep that in mind. You can use it as inspiration if you want, but keep in mind this is my first experience. I did 2 eye looks for each category inside that palette, so you can get a vibe of how it's going to look and feel. But I was still learning about the formula as I was applying, so some of the looks aren't that great if I'm being honest with you, and I did try to mainly do more wearable looks, not like what I have on today, looks that I feel that I could see an everyday person wearing, because that is how this palette is being marketed. You can obviously be as creative as you want with the palette. There are a million different directions you could go in, but not everyone's gonna be wearing a blue all over their eyes every day. And to test these eyeshadows, I did use Rephr and BK Beauty brushes. These were gifted to me in PR, but I really like them. I swear by them, and I use them for all of my other eyeshadow looks. So I wanted to give them a bit of a shout out, because I don't really talk about brushes on my channel, and I do think they make or break how you do your makeup sometimes. I personally really love the Rephr brushes because they have a whole line of eyeshadow brushes that are meant for smaller eyes, especially if you have hooded eyelids. I highly recommend these. They did not sponsor me to make this video, okay? But I do believe they have a Black Friday sale, BK Beauty and Rephr, probably going on right now. So I'm also going to list some of my top holy grail favorite eye brushes down below in case you are in the market for some new eyeshadow brushes. Alright, so for all the eyeshadow looks, I primed each one with the Yummy Skin Concealer as a base. And for the first look, I used the Rephr 02 brush and the taupe shade called Toasted all over the lids and the bottom lash line. I then took my finger to apply the shade Wish, which is described as a mauve with some silver shimmer, and tapped it in the center of the lids to the brow bone. Again, like I said earlier, most of the shimmers in this palette only really work well with my finger. For the inner corner, I used the number 3 pencil brush from Rephr, and then I took the matte black called Grounded and the BK Beauty Nikki LaRose N12 brush to create more of a smoky wing. And then for some definition, I used the Rephr 29 to line the rest of the eyes. I love this brush, probably one of my favorites out of all of them, because I can be very precise with my liner. In the end, I just finished it off with the Wonder Skin black liner and Clio mascara. Now for the next look, I used a Rephr number 15 brush and applied the shade Toasted on the outer corner. Went back in with the Nikki LaRose N12 brush and created a smoky wing with the Grounded black shade. Then I took the flaky shade called Open Heart with my finger and pressed it onto the lid. As you can kind of tell, it's a little bit of fallout. So make sure with all of the flaky shades to kind of blend that cream into the back of your hand before your lids to prevent from fallout. I also dragged it to the bottom lash line with the Rephr number 23 brush, and then finished off the look by lining the rest of my eyes with some black liner and mascara. Moving on to the next look, I used the Rephr 15 to apply Magic Moon all over the lids. I switched to the Rephr number 2 brush to smooth out the color more, and then I used used the number 23 brush and applied Star Power on the inner corner. I wanted a soft black wing, so I used the Eyeshadow number 2 brush to apply Grounded and a number 29 brush to line the rest of the eyes. After I defined the eyes, I used the Eyeshadow number 2 to blend the harsh lines a little bit more. Then I used the number 15 brush and applied the iridescent blue shade Dreamer on the brow bone just to give it a tad more interest and also just try out the shade. Now, as you can tell by the gray eyeshadow, it did crease. Part of that is user error. I definitely should have used a flat shader brush to get more even coverage on my eyes, but I will say, based off of using this palette a lot more times, the base that you have underneath these shadows matters, because if you have very oily eyelids, hooded eyelids, they will crease if you don't use the proper primer. I think in this case, the Danessa Myricks concealer wasn't the best primer, and depending on the shimmer you're applying on your eyes, you might want to use a glitter glue just to prevent fallout and also allow the shadows to give you some longevity. Now on the other side, I mimicked the same steps as the left side, except this time I used my finger and just topped it off with the Royal blue shade called Mother's Love, because of course we need to do something with this blue color. This is probably my favorite color out of the entire palette. Then I took the Rephr 28 brush and the silver sparkle shade called Northern Lights and applied it on the inner corner and stopped at the center of the lid. So this is the finished look for the blue palette. Now we're going to move on to the green palette. On this side, I started with the Eyeshadow number 2 brush and applied the shade Rooted on the crease and outer corner. Then I used my finger to apply the green shimmer called Mother Earth on the lids. On the bottom lash line, I used 2 Morphe brushes from the Ariel collection to apply the warm orange shimmer called Warmth on the bottom lash line. And then I just finished it off with some black liner and mascara. This was fairly easy, but it looks like I tried really hard with it. So I really like this one. And for the last look, it's very similar, except I'm applying these shades Toasted all over the lid with the number 2 brush, and then the gunmetal green shade called Mother Earth all over the lid with my finger. And on the inner corner, I applied the shade Warmth and took the Rephr number 3 and 29 brush to just redefine that black winged eyeshadow. So after doing about 6 different looks and trying this palette multiple times, I can conclude that I really do enjoy this formula. It is different, but that doesn't make it bad. There's a learning curve, but that doesn't make it bad. You have to decide what you're willing to do and how you're willing to adjust, if you have to adjust, to get these eyeshadows to look the way that you want. Because with the Rephr brushes, I found that most of the shimmer shadows don't really pick up well on the brush. I have to use my finger if I want impact. If I use the brush, it's going to be a very sheer application of just shimmer. It's not going to be as pigmented or impactful. And with your finger, you get a little bit more control. It's a bit stickier and there's not as much fallout when you're applying it, especially with the flaky shades. Again, you have to blend that on the back of your hand before applying it on your eyes. So if you're not a finger person, if you don't have like a silicone brush tip and you're not willing to work with it, then I would avoid this palette, truthfully. But I also wouldn't let that scare you away from buying this palette, because although it's different, once you learn how to work with these formulas, you're really gonna love them. And they are very comparable to a lot of indie eyeshadows, and I have the same experience with a lot of indie eyeshadows as well. Now, as for the matte eyeshadows, I really loved this formula. Again, it's sheer, buildable, but also very blendable. There's not too much fallout with the matte eyeshadow. I would just warn you about the black because it's super, super black. If you plan to use this color, make sure to do your eyes first before your foundation, because if any fallout gets on your face, it's going to smear if you're not careful. It's one of those kind of black eyeshadows, but it's a high quality black eyeshadow that I love to work with. Keep in mind that these are more sheer upon application. When I swatch it, I'm definitely getting pigment, but as I'm blending it, you're gonna have to build up that pigment as you go. And if that's gonna frustrate you, I completely understand, but that also allows you to have more control over the blend, over the pigment. And I personally prefer that over a super pigmented eyeshadow because it makes it a lot more versatile, in my opinion. Now, this is the point where you consider if you could actually see yourself wearing some of these looks or kind of creating your own combination of looks with these eyeshadow colors. this, and also ask yourself if you're willing to use your fingers to blend the shimmers, if you're willing to build up the eyeshadow. That is all your preference. The next thing you want to consider is what you might already have at home. Like I said, if you are someone who has a lot of indie eyeshadows, you might already have duplicates of these shadows because they're not groundbreaking colors by any means. Now, if you're not someone who really buys indie eyeshadows and you only buy shadows from Sephora or Ulta, these are going to be unique in your collection because you don't see this type of formula often, especially in stores where you can just walk in and buy a palette. They usually are only available from indie brands online. So if you're willing to splurge a little bit and you want something to add a little bit more fun to your eyeshadow collection or eyeshadow routine, I think that these are going to be it for you. I did also buy last year's palette, so if you are someone with last year's palette, I do think this year's palette would still be worth purchasing because I didn't really find duplicates in this year's palette. If you actually swatch them side by side, the colors are very complementary to each other, but they're not the same, which I absolutely love because I feel like I'm just adding to the color story. I'm not repeating or duplicating the color story. If anything, I kind of like this year's color story better because this is more true blue, and you would think last year's was a true blue, but last year's actually leaned more teal on the eyes. Now, if you're someone like me and you love the green, blue, purple color story, these are your colors. You want something that's wearable, but also inspires you to get out of your comfort zone and have a little bit more fun, and you want to play with makeup, but also you want shimmers that are going to make people ask you what the heck is on your eyes. This is the palette for you. And not only are you paying for the high quality eyeshadows, but you'd also be paying for the Danessa Myricks kind of palette ecosystem, because you can have all of these in one big palette, or you can take them apart and click them together to have a travel size palette, or you can carry individual shades if you want, and you can mix and match to create your own palettes. And for someone who's always trying to find new and fresh ways to look at my makeup to get more use out of it, this personally aligns with my makeup philosophy, which just allows a lot of versatility in my makeup routine and makeup inventory, and that is so important to me because in the long run it actually prevents me from buying other eyeshadow palettes. So for example, if another indie brand comes out with a palette, right? And I really like and want that palette, I can go into my Danessa Myricks palettes and try to recreate it with what I already have, which might then save me money from buying another eyeshadow palette. Now, my only concern, however, is the fact that she's probably going to come out with these every single year because they're a hit. I actually hope that in the coming years, instead of forcing us to buy full-size palettes with maybe shades that are gonna end up being repetitive at some point, like most brands do, I hope she just keeps coming out with more of the mini palettes with matte eyeshadows, because I do think there's always a market for neutral eyeshadows, as boring as they may be, especially at Sephora, but also that will allow me to add to this big palette that I already purchased, and that gives us more control and choice as consumers to buy, you know, a smaller palette over a huge palette for $128 with maybe half the shades we don't even like. And if you're not sure because the colors intimidate you, I will say more than half of the palette is fairly neutral. I think what might scare you are these purple, like these two purple shimmers and the blue shimmers, but all of the other colors are pretty neutral. I consider green a neutral. I don't know if you consider green a neutral, but I do. And you don't have to wear this blue or purple all over the eyes. You can literally use it as a pop of color on the inner corner, on the bottom lash line, and then apply the rest as your everyday. You could also wear each shimmer, just all of the lids with some mascara and liner, and that will just make it more wearable as well. This is a huge win in my book, one of the best launches of the year. Even last year's palette, I got a lot of use out of that. I traveled with that palette and it just really excited me. A lot of brands are not coming out with these colors, these textures and formulas, specifically brands that are in Sephora. Of course, indie brands we know have been doing this for a while, but Sephora brands don't tend to have the bravery to come out with something like this, so I really give Danessa Myricks credit for that, especially when most people just want the boring makeup. So now the choice is completely up to you. Let me know in the comments below if you are considering this palette and if you plan to buy it. Just a reminder, you do not have to pay the full price for this. Hopefully Danessa Myricks will include the palette in her 30% off Black Friday sale, because if she doesn't, I'm gonna be really upset. But I will try to update you in the community tab, and if for some reason you couldn't get your hands on it on her website, maybe Sephora will be doing the 20% off, and that will be another chance for you to buy it. But as always, consider your budget, your preferences, and what you already have. If you can dupe the vibes, you don't need the palette. And with all that being said, my work here is done. Thank you all so much for the continuous love and support. I hope you are enjoying this review-a-thon. Do not forget to subscribe if you're new, like this video if you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!